Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're actually going to be taking a look at how to actually write some of these early Aguauian cultures that we talked about in the last video. So one of the things that I want to take a look at is having these ideas as part of what makes them early Aguauian. For instance, one of the ways that we can do this is actually taking a look at the progress and the mindset that was required from going to hunter-gatherers to Aguauian. So what we can do is that we can actually show early on what the hunter-gatherer life was like. We can show that you have small groups of people. A movie that really does this really well is the movie Apocalypto by Mel Gibson. That's sort of a historical fiction that actually we can take a look and see, hey, this is the difference between a hunter-gatherer and Aguauian. Because what happens in that story is that you have hunter-gatherer groups that are really small villages, and they are kidnapped by a much larger, much more complex system in the hunter-gatherer. Now, one of the things that they don't really mention about in the movie, and it's hinted that it is a Mayan culture, but it's not explicitly said. But one of the things that is not mentioned in the movie is that there are sometimes downfalls to Aguauian cultures. For instance, there was a cataclysmic event that essentially wiped out early Mesoamerican empire, the Mayans. This is called the classic Maya collapse. This happens roughly about the 9th century, 7th to 9th centuries, with an earlier one happening in the 2nd century. Now there could be a number of reasons why this happened. A couple of theories include foreign invasion, collapse of trade routes, epidemic diseases, and then drought theories. These are all ideas of what could have brought about the collapse of the society. Now, when we write our stories, we're telling our stories in a way that can encourage a foundation that we can build upon. So when we're thinking about world building, we're not necessarily thinking about how things are going to play out for our main character. And as always, a lot of what we're talking about here isn't what's going to end up on the page, but something that's going to be a foundation that you can build on top of. And when we get a understanding of what our world looks like, we create a world that's live and vibrant. It adds authenticity to our worlds. Now, we're not necessarily just talking about how the placements of the continents, like we had discussed in previous videos, but we're also talking about how people are interacting with each other. A common complaint that you can see in world building is how unrealistic it can be. Now, when you introduce elements like magic systems, this will alter how things are played out. For me personally, having a structure when it comes to your magic system is one of those things that can make or break how the magic system interacts with your story. If you have sorcerers, or you have deities, or you have people who can change drastically how the world functions, this really can cause problems later on, because if one person can change how a society is interacting with the world, this will remove some of the connections that you are trying to create with your reader. It's hard for a reader to truly understand the consequences of land masses being altered on a grand scale, because that's not something we see every day. That's not to say that if it's done right that it can't be entertaining. My point here is that we're have to think about how our reader is going to react to this information. If you don't limit the type of magic that your characters can do, one small type of magic can severely change how things play out. For instance, transportation magic is one of those things that can totally destroy some of the trade elements. So for instance, think about it this way. So say you have a magic system. In an early Aguauian society, you don't need something like horses. You don't need something for long distance transport. So if anybody can use transportation magic, basically what you're doing is you're allowing the people to be able to move goods across great distances, and without actually having any sort of rules to that or having limitations to that, that will change drastically how quickly a society can change and adapt. One of the other things, one of the downsides to having a transportation system is that we always have to remember that there are always costs and consequences to the elements we add to our story. So, in the instance of somebody with transportation magic, say you have an epidemic, somebody goes from one country to another country. Now, the person doesn't realize that they're sick. Now, how does that play out? So, you have a disease like what we saw with early American history. You saw that a lot of the Native American tribes fell because of the diseases that were brought over from Europe. These were diseases that were brought about because Europeans were in close proximity to these animals. Now, that does not mean that there was anything untoward going on or anything like that, but the simple fact that you have animals that are living in close proximity to humans means that there are more opportunities for animal diseases to mutate and jump species. These are some of the concerns that we have with sicknesses in general. One of the things in the past is mad cow disease or bird flu. These are diseases that are specifically coded for specific species. But if they jump the species barrier, they will severely change how the world has to deal with these diseases. For us, if I go and interact with a chicken that has the bird flu, I am not necessarily going to have that same issue. But if I interact with a chicken that has bird flu and then I go interact with another bird, I can be a carrier for that disease. Now, one of the ways that we can think about this is that the sickness smallpox, initially, it was a very deadly disease, even in Europe. About 1/3 of the population that came into contact with it ended up dying. And those that survived ended up with severe pockmarks. This is the result of the body trying to fight this disease. But one of the things that they found later on is that when certain people had what was called cowpox, which is a sibling disease that is particular for cows, when they got cowpox, they became immune to smallpox. This is the basis that they use to create the idea of vaccinations. Vaccinations and inoculations are the foundation of preventative medicine that we use even to today. As recent as 2020, these are the same foundational elements that we are able to put into our stories when it comes dealing with early Aguauian cultures. How does disease, how does closeness play a part in it? In early Aguauian cultures, you don't have the sanitation, you don't have the robust ability to stay clean. Only when there is a concerted effort from the populace, from the culture, to maintain cleanliness. There are certain cultures over the course of millennia have developed a cleanliness mindset when it comes to day-to-day life. This means that they are going to be far less susceptible to sicknesses and diseases. For instance, Black Death was one of those diseases that played a huge part in the formation of Europe at the time. But it didn't affect certain cultures, specifically the Jewish culture, because they have a cultural aspect of cleanliness, of taking baths, of getting themselves clean. And some other countries like Poland, from my understanding, had that same thing because they learned it from the Jewish cultures where they took baths regularly. Now, cleanliness is one of those things that can make or break how a culture is able to deal with sicknesses. Early diseases is not something that we truly understand. When we're talking about hunter-gatherers, we're not spending a ton of time together, or we're not spending a ton of time in close proximity to A, animals, or B, carriers, people who have the sicknesses and passing it on. So when we're talking about how these things are going to be playing a part in our world, say we have a farmhand. Let's go with the whole stereotype of farmhand. What does that person look like? What type of diseases has that person engaged with? Why is the person who works on the farm less culturally aware than the person who grows up in the city? These are things that we can see even today. Somebody who lives in the city has a completely different mindset than somebody who's living in a rural area. And of course, One of the things that we fail to remember is that just because they live in a rural area doesn't mean that they're uneducated or that they're stupid. They have different perspectives and they have different priorities when it comes to their life. Their priorities are a lot more earthy, a lot more down to the day-to-day, rather than in the city where it is a lot more about trade. It's a lot more about manufacture. Even as far back as Middle Ages, they recognize that there is a different mindset between an urban community and a rural community. So when we're telling these stories, it's something that we need to keep in mind, is that we are telling these stories that they make sense. So if you have a character, say you have a character who grew up on the farm, when you take that person out of the farm and you put them into an urban area, why are they different? Create a instance where they're not going to understand the subcultural differences between rural and urban. One of the things that you should be careful of is that you don't want to make it seem like the person who's coming from the rural area is stupid or is unintelligent, because that's not the case. That's not always the case. You can have somebody who's very, very intelligent in a rural area, but once you pull them out of the comfort zone, once you pull them out of the area where they are going to be comfortable and have an experience dealing with the day-to-day, they are going to struggle with the nuances that is going to be found in an urban environment. So this is something that we need to keep in mind when we're telling these stories, is that we're telling these stories in a way that is realistic. This is always the purpose of my world building videos, is that we want to make sure that we're creating living, breathing worlds that are not just fake cardboard cutouts of the things that we could see in TV and movies, because the issue is that TV and movies are always going to be inherently simplistic when it comes to how they are portraying different environments. Because what happens is that because of how those writers are experiencing things outside their normal, they have to rely on other forms of media. Typically, the forms of media that most people rely on are actually other movies and books and TV shows. The problem is that, and I've mentioned this before, you get a whisper down the lane mentality when it comes to the reality of how people are actually living their lives. So if somebody spends a lot of time taking a look at, oh, down on the farm, everybody who lives on the farm are idiots, and then they go write a story, they're going to start with the idea that every person on the farm is just waiting for somebody with more intelligence to save them, which is incredibly insulting. And this can be seen not just with the urban and rural divide, but other subcultures are going to play a part in this too. You have the low-income urban community versus the middle-class suburban subculture. Just because they don't share the same thing or they don't have the same perspective doesn't mean that one person is less intelligent than the other. If you take an Ivy League educated person and you put them in an urban environment, a low economic place, they're going to struggle in a way that they wouldn't recognize, because we don't know what we don't know. So when we're writing our early Aguauian cultures, we need to make sure that we are formulating it based off of reality. We're formulating it based off of how things actually took place and how people actually generally are going to interact with each other. And what that's going to come down to is how people are going to realistically deal with the unknown. And one of the things that allows for us in character to have a person deal with the unknown is you have them on the outside coming in. But as I just said, we don't want to put them in a position where they are seen as less intelligent because they are from a less complex system. Just because it's less complex doesn't mean that person is inherently less intelligent. All right, everybody, that's all I had for today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave them in the comments below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that brown to which I go.